There was a winter evening in 1908 when a young journalist named Napoleon Hill walked into the office of Andrew Carnegie, expecting an interview that would last no longer than 3 hours. He left that office 3 days later, carrying within him a question that would consume the next 20 years of his life. Carnegie, the steel king who had risen from poverty to become one of the wealthiest men in human history, had asked him a single sentence that pierced through every illusion the young man had ever carried about success. "Mr. Hill," he said, leaning forward in his leather chair, "do you know why most men die without ever having truly lived?" The young journalist, eager and ambitious, gave a dozen answers. Carnegie smiled and shook his head at each one. Then, after a long silence, the old industrialist whispered the truth that would become the cornerstone of an entire philosophy of achievement, because they have never decided what they want. I have spent decades studying this single sentence. I have walked through the libraries of Edison and the boardrooms of Ford. I have sat with men who built railroads and women who built fortunes from nothing but a quiet determination. And I tell you now, with the certainty that only 20 years of investigation can give a man, that Carnegie was right. The greatest tragedy of human existence is not failure, it is not poverty, it is not even death. The greatest tragedy is to live an entire life without ever having defined with crystalline clarity what one is here to accomplish. This is the silent disease of the modern world. This is the invisible plague that walks beside every man who wakes up at 40 and wonders where his years have gone. The ancients understood something we have forgotten. They knew that a man without a purpose is not merely a man without direction. He is a man whose very life force begins to dissolve, like water poured upon sand. The Greeks called it telos. The Romans called it vocatio. The mystics of the East called it dharma. Every great civilization in every great age has recognized that a human being is not designed to wander. He is designed to aim. And when he loses his aim, something in him begins to die long before his body is buried. Carnegie understood this. Edison understood this. Ford, Rockefeller, Lincoln, every figure I studied across those 2 decades understood that the first and greatest law of achievement is this: you must know with absolute precision what you want, and you must want it with the totality of your being. But here begins the strangest discovery of my entire investigation. The detail that most men overlook is hidden right here at the very threshold of the matter. When I asked the great achievers of my time how they came to their purpose, almost none of them spoke of inspiration. Almost none of them described a sudden flash of revelation. What they described instead was a decision, a cold, deliberate, almost ruthless decision to choose one path among the 1,000 that lay before them and to close every other door behind them. This is the part of the story that the modern world has buried beneath its noise. We have been taught to believe that purpose is something we discover, as if it were a treasure waiting in some hidden room of the soul. But the men who built the modern world taught me a different truth. Purpose is not found. Purpose is forged. Consider what this means for a moment. Consider how radically this overturns everything the modern man has been told about his own life. We have been raised in an age that worships options. We have been told that to keep our possibilities open is to remain free, that to commit too early is to limit ourselves, that the wise man hedges his bets and waits for clarity to arrive. But I tell you that this is the philosophy of a sleepwalker. The wise man, the man of true power, does not wait for clarity. He creates it. He chooses his mountain, and in the very act of choosing, the path begins to appear beneath his feet. This is what Carnegie meant when he said that most men die without having lived. They spent their entire existence waiting for a sign that was never going to come because the sign was supposed to come from within them, and they had never learned to listen. Now, what was it that Carnegie called this principle? He called it the definite major purpose, not a wish, not a dream, not a vague intention, a definite major organizing purpose, a purpose so clearly defined that it could be written down in a single sentence, a purpose so deeply held that it would survive every storm, every betrayal, every season of doubt. He told me that in all his years of building industries and observing men, he had never once seen a person achieve anything significant who did not possess this kind of purpose. And he told me, with the gravity of a man who had earned the right to such statements, that this single principle was the master key to every other law of success. I want you to pause here for a moment and let me ask you something directly. When was the last time you sat alone in absolute silence and asked yourself what you actually wanted from this one life you have been given? Not what your parents wanted for you, not what your culture rewarded, not what your circumstances seemed to allow, but what you, in the deepest chamber of your own soul, were placed upon this earth to do. If you cannot remember the last time you asked this question, then you are not alone. You are walking with the great mass of humanity that has forgotten how to ask it. But you are also, in this very moment, standing at the threshold of the most important decision you will ever make. The mirror of great lives shows us this truth more clearly than any argument could. Take the case of Thomas Edison, a man I came to know not only through his words, but through the testimony of those who worked beside him. Edison did not become the inventor of his age because he was the most intelligent man of his time. He was not. He did not succeed because he had the most resources. He had almost none in his early years. He succeeded because from the time he was a boy, he had decided with unshakable conviction that he would devote his life to the discovery of the unknown. When he failed 10,000 times in the development of the electric lamp, the question of giving up never entered his mind. It could not enter his mind. The space in his mind where giving up might have lived was already occupied by his definite major purpose. But the most surprising part comes only now. Edison once told me in a conversation I will never forget that the moment he defined his purpose with absolute clarity was the moment his failures stopped being failures. They became data. They became stepping stones. They became the necessary substance through which his purpose was being refined. Do you understand what he was saying? He was saying that the very meaning of failure is determined by the presence or absence of a definite major purpose. Without purpose, every setback is a wound. With purpose, every setback is a teacher. The same event, the same defeat, the same disappointment takes on completely different meanings depending on whether the man experiencing it knows where he is going. This is the alchemy of purpose. This is the inner transformation that turns lead into gold. Consider also the example of Abraham Lincoln, perhaps the most instructive case in all of American history. Lincoln failed in business. He lost the woman he loved to death. He suffered breakdowns that left him bedridden for months. He lost election after election after election. By the standards of any reasonable observer, he should have given up before he reached the age of 40. But Lincoln carried within him something that the reasonable observer could not see. He carried a definite major purpose so deep that it could absorb every defeat without being shaken. He believed, with the totality of his being, that he had been placed upon this earth to do something of significance for his country. And when the moment finally came, when the nation itself stood at the edge of dissolution, the man who walked into the presidency was a man who had been forged in the fires of 2 decades of failure. I want you to think about this carefully. Lincoln did not succeed despite his failures. He succeeded because of them. And he was able to succeed because of them only because he had a purpose strong enough to give those failures meaning. This is the law that the modern world has forgotten. Every great life, when examined closely, reveals the same pattern. A purpose so clear that it becomes a compass so reliable that every storm becomes navigable, and a navigation so faithful that eventually the destination is reached. This is not motivation. This is not positive thinking. This is the cold, clear architecture of how human achievement actually works. And yet, when I look upon the spirit of our age, I see something that troubles me deeply. I see a generation of men and women who have been given more opportunity than any generation in human history, and who are using that opportunity to drift. I see young people with brilliant minds spending their evenings consuming images they will not remember by morning. I see men with the capacity for greatness wasting their primes in jobs they hate, surrounded by people they do not respect, pursuing goals they did not choose. I see a world drowning in distraction, where the very technologies that were meant to amplify human potential are instead amplifying human aimlessness. The modern man has more tools than Carnegie ever dreamed of, and yet he uses them to scatter himself across 1,000 directions, never landing fully in any one of them. What Hill said about this subject is deeply unsettling, and I will share it with you now. He observed that the greatest enemy of the modern soul is not laziness, it is not even ignorance, it is the illusion of motion, the illusion that because we are busy, we are progressing, the illusion that because we have many interests, we have purpose, the illusion that because we are responding to the demands of our screens, we are doing meaningful work. But motion is not direction. Activity is not achievement. And a life of constant movement without a definite major purpose is a life of running in circles, no matter how fast the running may be. We are not failing because we are not trying. We are failing because we are trying everything, and therefore truly trying nothing. Here begins the darkest game of the subconscious mind. When a man does not consciously choose his purpose, his subconscious will choose one for him, and the purpose it chooses will almost always be the lowest common denominator of his fears and his appetites. He will spend his life pursuing comfort, because his subconscious has decided, in the absence of conscious instruction, that comfort is the safest goal. He will spend his life seeking approval, because his subconscious has learned that approval reduces anxiety. He will spend his life accumulating possessions, because his subconscious has confused accumulation with achievement. And he will arrive at the end of his life with a house full of objects, a calendar full of appointments, and a soul empty of any sense that he has actually lived. Now, I want to tell you something that took me many years to understand, and that I share with you now as the most important practical insight of this entire reflection. A definite major purpose is not a goal. Let me say that again, because the distinction is everything. A definite major purpose is not a goal. A goal is something you wish to acquire. A purpose is something you have decided to become. A goal can be achieved and then forgotten. A purpose reorganizes the very structure of your identity. When Edison decided to become the discoverer of the unknown, he did not set a goal. He underwent a transformation. He became, in his own self-conception, a man whose entire existence was oriented around a single mission. And once that transformation occurred, the goals took care of themselves. This is why the autosuggestion practiced by the great achievers was so powerful. They were not merely repeating affirmations to themselves. They were not engaging in shallow exercises of positive thinking. They were performing a deep, deliberate, daily reprogramming of their own subconscious minds. They were instructing the deepest layer of their being to align itself with their conscious purpose. And the subconscious, when it receives such instructions consistently and with emotion, has no choice but to obey. It begins to filter the world differently. It begins to notice opportunities the unfocused mind would have missed. It begins to attract, through what the ancients called the magnetic mind, the people and circumstances and resources that match the frequency of the chosen purpose. I want you to understand the gravity of what I am telling you. Within you, at this very moment, sleeps a power so vast that it can rearrange the entire geometry of your life. But this power does not respond to wishes. It does not respond to vague hopes. It does not respond to the half-hearted dreams that flicker through your mind on a Sunday afternoon and then disappear by Monday morning. This power responds only to a definite major purpose, charged with the heat of unshakable conviction and held in the mind day after day, year after year, until it becomes the dominant signal of your inner life. When that happens, and only when that happens, the dormant power awakens. The real turning point begins here. The real turning point begins in the moment when a man stops asking the world to give him a sign and begins instead to give the world a signal. The signal is his definite major purpose. The signal is the clarity of his decision. The signal is the unwavering broadcast of his intention into the field of life. And life, which is far more responsive than the cynical have ever realized, begins to respond. Doors that seemed locked begin to open. People who seemed unreachable begin to appear. Resources that seemed impossible begin to materialize. The man who once felt that the universe was indifferent to him discovers, with quiet astonishment, that the universe was simply waiting for him to declare himself. But I must warn you of something, because I have seen too many promising men fall at this very threshold. The definite major purpose must be your own. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be copied from another person whose life seemed admirable to you from the outside. A purpose that is not authentically yours will not generate the inner heat required to sustain you through the long winters of the journey. It will not survive the hours of doubt at 3 a.m, when every voice in your mind is telling you to give up. Only a purpose that has emerged from the deepest honesty of your own being can do that. Only a purpose that you would pursue even if no one ever knew, even if no one ever applauded, has the strength to reach completion. This is why the work of finding your definite major purpose requires a kind of inner descent. It requires you to go beneath the noise of your conditioning, beneath the expectations of your family, beneath the rewards of your culture, beneath the comparisons that have shaped your sense of what is impressive or admirable. You must descend into the chamber of your own soul, the place where no one else has ever been, and you must ask yourself with absolute honesty what you would do with your one life if you knew you could not fail. What would you build? What would you create? What would you serve? The answers that come from that depth are not the answers your social mind would give. They are quieter, they are stranger, but they are the answers that contain your purpose. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is this: the descent is the price of the ascent. You cannot rise into your highest possibility without first sinking into the truth of who you actually are. Carnegie understood this. He told me that the wealthiest moment of his life was not the day he sold his steel company for hundreds of millions of dollars. It was the day decades earlier when, as a poor immigrant boy, he sat alone and decided what kind of man he would become. That decision, he said, was the foundation upon which everything else was eventually built. The decision came first. The decision was the seed. Everything else was the harvest. There is a paradox at the heart of this teaching that I must share with you, because without understanding it, the entire principle can be misunderstood. A definite major purpose, properly held, is at once the most personal thing a man possesses and the most impersonal thing he can serve. It is personal because it emerges from the unique architecture of his own soul. And yet it is impersonal because, once chosen, it becomes larger than the personality that chose it. The man becomes a servant of the purpose rather than the purpose being a servant of the man. This is the difference between a life that achieves and a life that merely accumulates. The achiever serves something larger than himself. The accumulator only serves himself and discovers eventually that the self alone is too small a master to give a life meaning. There is a light that lives in the heart of every struggle, and the struggle to find and hold a definite major purpose is no exception. The light is this: the very difficulty of the search is what makes the finding meaningful. If purpose were easy to discover, it would be cheap to hold. If clarity came without cost, it would lose its power the moment it arrived. The great achievers were not given their purposes on a silver platter. They wrestled for them. They argued with themselves through long nights. They tested provisional purposes and discarded them. They followed false trails and learned from the dead ends. And eventually, through the slow alchemy of attention and honesty, the real purpose emerged from the depths and announced itself. I observed something curious in all the great lives I studied, and I want to share it with you as a final piece of the puzzle. Every man who achieved something worthy did so eventually in service of something beyond himself. Carnegie became a steel king, but his purpose was never simply wealth. His deeper purpose was to redistribute opportunity to those who had been denied it, and in his later years he gave away the bulk of his fortune to libraries and universities that still serve millions today. Edison invented relentlessly, but his purpose was never simply invention. His deeper purpose was to lift the burden of darkness from human existence, to give the common man light and sound and motion that had once belonged only to dreams. Lincoln did not merely seek the presidency. He sought to preserve a union and to free a people, and the weight of that larger purpose is what gave his suffering its meaning. The lesson is unmistakable. A definite major purpose grows in power in direct proportion to its capacity to serve something larger than the man who holds it. The selfish purpose runs out of fuel quickly. The purpose tied to the welfare of others, to the elevation of life itself, to the building of something that will outlast the body that conceived it, draws upon a reservoir that does not run dry. And so I ask you to consider, as you begin the inner work of defining your own purpose, not only what you want to gain, but what you want to give. Not only what you want to build, but who will be lifted by what you build. Not only what you want to achieve, but what part of the human story will be different because you walked through it. The answers to these questions will not diminish the personal nature of your purpose. On the contrary, they will deepen it, root it, give it the kind of power that comfort-seeking ambition can never possess. This is the secret that the great philanthropist discovered, and it is the same secret that every saint and sage in every tradition has tried to communicate. The path of true achievement is the path of devoted service, channeled through the unique gifts that you, and only you, were given to bring into the world. Let me leave you with an image that I have carried with me through all the years of this work. Imagine a man standing in a vast, dark forest at night. He has no map. He has no compass. He has no idea which direction to walk. Around him, in every direction, lies the same tangled darkness. Most men in this position will simply sit down. They will tell themselves that without a map, movement is foolish. They will wait for someone to come and rescue them. And they will sit there for the rest of their lives, slowly forgetting that they ever wanted to leave the forest at all. But there is another kind of man, the kind I have spent my life studying. This man does something different. He stands very still and listens to the silence within himself. He waits until he hears, faintly at first, the call of his own deepest longing. And then, even though he cannot see the path, he begins to walk in the direction of that call. Step by step, the path appears beneath his feet. Step by step, the darkness yields. And eventually, sometimes after many years, he emerges into a clearing he could not have imagined when he began. So I leave you tonight with a question, and I ask you to carry it with you not as a burden, but as a companion. When you set this aside and return to the small affairs of your evening, when you walk through the rooms of your home and prepare for the sleep that will take you into another morning, ask yourself this. If you knew with absolute certainty that you had only one life, and that the meaning of that life would be determined entirely by what you decided to pursue with it, what would you choose? Not what would be reasonable to choose, not what would be safe to choose, not what others would approve of you for choosing, but what, in the deepest chamber of your soul, you were placed upon this earth to do. The answer is already within you. It has been within you all along. The only question is whether you will have the courage to listen, the honesty to recognize it, and the faith to follow it wherever it leads. When was the last time you truly listened to the voice of your definite major purpose? And when, if not now, will you finally begin?